When you hear British Army, what image comes to mind? Probably a unified force, right? But what if I told you that iconic thin red line wasn't as British as history books make it seem? Prepare to shatter your perceptions of empire and uncover Scotland's surprising and often overlooked role. The popular imagination of the British Empire is dominated by a singular, monolithic figure, the Redcoat. We picture him as a sturdy yeoman from the shires of England, fighting for king and country, projecting the power of London to the furthest corners of the globe. In this traditional narrative, the army is a seamless extension of English will, a homogeneous machine of conquest where national distinctions are melted down into a uniform brick red. We see the lines of infantry at Waterloo or the squares in the Sudan, and we see a British force. But if we were to zoom in, to walk down those ranks and listen to the voices of the men holding the muskets, the accent that would greet us would, disproportionately, not be from the rolling hills of the Cotswolds or the streets of London. It would be the guttural Gaelic of the Highlands or the broad Scots of the Lowlands. For a century and a half, the British Army was powered by a hidden engine. While the orders were written in English and signed in Westminster, the shock power, the terrifying, aggressive edge of the imperial sword, was frequently Scottish. This is the great paradox of the 18th and 19th centuries. Scotland, a nation that represented only about 10 to 12% of the United Kingdom's population, often provided between a quarter and a third of the army's rank and file, and an even higher percentage of its officers. This was not a minor contribution. It was a demographic anomaly that reshaped the history of warfare. The term "the thin red line" is etched into military folklore. It conjures images of stoic bravery, of a few standing against the many. But it is also a term that belongs specifically to a Scottish regiment, the 93rd Highlanders. It is a phrase that encapsulates the Scottish military experience, a small, distinct group of men, often stretched to the absolute limit, holding the line for an empire that had a complicated, often painful relationship with their homeland. To understand the British Empire, one must look past the Union Jack and see the lion rampant. One must understand that the thin red line was not just a formation on a battlefield. It was a human wall built from the sons of the glens, exported to fight and die on foreign soil. This series will peel back the layers of the British myth. It will examine how a nation that rose in rebellion against the Crown in 1745 became that same Crown's most effective weapon by 1757. It will look at the economics of the Highland clearances and how the destruction of a way of life at home fueled the expansion of an empire abroad. It will take us from the freezing plains of North America to the scorching heat of India, and finally to the Crimea, where the legend of the invincible Scot was cemented in blood. The story of the Scottish soldier is not merely a subchapter of British history. It is the story of the empire itself. It is a narrative of exploitation and heroism, of desperate poverty and martial glory. The Redcoat was not a monolith. He was often a man in a kilt, marching to the sound of bagpipes, an instrument of war that terrified opponents from the French Guard to the Russian cavalry. This is the story of how Scotland, through blood and bayonet, punched far above its weight class and forged an identity that endures to this day. It is time to look closely at the men inside the uniforms and recognize the distinct, undeniable tartan thread that holds the tapestry of British military history together. To understand how the Scottish Highlander became the vanguard of the British Empire, we must first revisit a time when he was its greatest threat. In 1746, the Jacobite dream died in the sleet and mud of Culloden Moor. The British government, terrified by how close Bonnie Prince Charlie had come to toppling the Hanoverian throne, unleashed a campaign of brutal suppression. The pacification of the Highlands was systematic and cultural. The clan system was dismantled. The wearing of tartan was banned by the Dress Act of 1746, and the playing of bagpipes was outlawed as an instrument of war. The Highlands were treated not as a part of the United Kingdom, but as a conquered and occupied territory, teeming with potential insurgents who needed to be broken. Yet, scarcely a decade later, the geopolitical landscape shifted violently. Britain found itself embroiled in the 7 Years' War, a truly global conflict against France that stretched from the forests of North America to the plains of India. The British Army was dangerously overstretched. There were simply not enough Englishmen willing to take the King's shilling to garrison a rapidly expanding empire. In London, desperation bred innovation. William Pitt the Elder, the Prime Minister, looked north to the very mountains that had recently harboured rebellion and saw not enemies, but a vast reservoir of untapped martial potential. Pitt's strategy was a masterstroke of political alchemy. He proposed to harness the warlike traditions of the chaotic North and direct them against Britain's external enemies. He sought to transform the disaffected Jacobite clansmen into the shock troops of the British Crown. It was a gamble of the highest order, arming the very men who had recently charged British lines with broadswords. But Pitt understood something profound about the Highland psyche. The loyalty of the clansmen was to his chief, and if the chiefs could be commissioned as colonels and captains in the British Army, their tenants would follow them to the ends of the earth. This recruitment drive, however, was not fueled solely by a newfound patriotism or a love for King George. It was driven by the harsh realities of economic conscription. The Highland way of life was collapsing. The traditional chiefs were transforming into modern landlords, eager to clear their lands of tenant farmers to make way for profitable sheep runs. This process, known as the Highland clearances, created a diaspora of desperate men. For a young Highlander facing eviction and starvation, the army offered a lifeline. It provided pay, food, and a chance to retain a shred of his cultural identity, for within the regiments, the ban on tartan was lifted. The kilt and the pipes, illegal in the glens, were celebrated in the ranks. So began the exodus. Regiments like the 78th Fraser's Highlanders and the 42nd Royal Highland Regiment, the famous Black Watch, were raised and immediately shipped overseas. They were sent to the most rugged theatres of war, particularly North America, where their skills in irregular warfare and their hardiness in rough terrain made them invaluable. They were no longer rebels. They were the phalanx of the North, marching under the Union Jack. The impact was immediate and staggering. In the dense woodlands of North America and the rocky coasts of the Caribbean, the French found themselves facing a new kind of British soldier, one who charged with a ferocity that seemed almost atavistic. The integration of these regiments changed the character of the British Army. It introduced a distinct subculture within the military establishment, one defined by fierce internal loyalty and an aggressive tactical doctrine. By the time the 7 Years' War concluded, the reputation of the Highland soldier had undergone a complete reversal. They were no longer seen as savages to be feared by London, but as savages to be feared by London's enemies. The great recruitment had succeeded, binding the martial spirit of Scotland to the imperial ambitions of England, forging a weapon that would soon be deployed to conquer a quarter of the globe. The weapon forged in the Highlands was not kept in reserve. It was immediately thrust into the forefront of Britain's most critical campaigns, becoming the spearhead of imperial expansion. Wherever the map turned red, the tartan was usually the first thing to appear on the horizon. The ubiquity of Scottish regiments in the 18th and early 19th centuries is startling. They were the omnipresent backbone of the army, deployed with a frequency that suggests a deliberate reliance on their aggressive capabilities. Take, for instance, the pivotal year of 1759, the year of miracles. On the sheer cliffs protecting Quebec, the fate of North America hung in the balance. General James Wolfe faced an impossible task: to assault a fortress deemed impregnable. In the dead of night, it was the Fraser's Highlanders, many of whom had fought against the British Crown just 13 years earlier, who led the perilous ascent up the goat paths to the heights of Abraham. There is a profound irony in this moment. As they scaled the cliffs, they were challenged by French sentries. It was a Highland officer, fluent in French from his years in exile after the Jacobite rebellions, who answered the challenge and deceived the guards, allowing the British force to gain a foothold. When the battle commenced the following morning, the Highlanders unleashed a ferocious broadsword charge, a tactic considered obsolete by European standards, but one that shattered the French morale and secured Canada for the British Empire. But the Scottish footprint was not limited to the freezing forests of the New World. Thousands of miles away, in the suffocating heat of the Indian subcontinent, the East India Company was fighting for survival and dominance. Here, too, the Scottish regiments were indispensable. In the wars against the formidable Tipu Sultan of Mysore, regiments like the 73rd and 74th Highlanders earned a reputation for stoicism under fire that bordered on the inhuman. It was in India that a young Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, learned the true value of the Scottish soldier. He came to regard the 74th Highlanders as his fighting regiment, a unit he could throw into the most desperate situations with the certainty that they would not break. This reliance was not without cost. The casualty lists from these Indian campaigns were horrific, decimated not just by enemy fire, but by cholera and heat stroke. Yet the flow of recruits from the Highlands did not stem. The regiments became a home for men who had no home left, a wandering tribe of warriors whose loyalty was transferred from the clan chief to the regimental colonel. As the 19th century dawned and the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte fell across Europe, the Scottish regiments have become the celebrities of the British Army. In 1801, at the Battle of Alexandria in Egypt, the Black Watch engaged the French Invincibles in hand-to-hand combat, capturing their standard and destroying their reputation. This victory sent a shockwave through Europe. The naked savages of the north had bested the finest troops of the French Republic. By the time the Peninsular War raged in Spain and Portugal, the sight of the kilt had become a psychological weapon. French generals wrote specifically about the Amazonian soldiers who fought with a distinct fury. The Highland regiments, the Gordons, the Camerons, the Seaforths, were used repeatedly to storm breaches and hold untenable positions. They were the fire brigade of the army, rushed to wherever the line was buckling. The popular image of the British square repelling French cavalry is iconic. But often, the men inside those squares were singing Gaelic songs to keep their rhythm, loading and firing with a mechanical precision born of a culture that had been entirely militarized. The empire was expanding, its borders pushed outward by the bayonets of men who, in another life, would have been simple crofters and herdsmen. If the Scottish soldier's reputation was built in the forests of America and the dust of India, it was immortalized on a chilly October morning in 1854 on the Crimean Peninsula. The Battle of Balaclava is often remembered for the disastrous charge of the Light Brigade, a blunder of epic proportions. But before that tragedy unfolded, a moment of tactical perfection occurred that would give the British Army its most enduring epithet. This was the moment of the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders, the only infantry regiment standing between a massive Russian cavalry force and the British supply base. The situation was dire. The Ottoman allies manning the forward redoubts had been overrun, fleeing in panic before a Russian advance. Surging forward came the main body of the Russian cavalry, a thundering avalanche of nearly 2,500 hussars and Cossacks. Their objective was Balaclava harbour. If they took it, the British army would be cut off from its supplies and likely destroyed. Standing in their path was a single regiment of foot, the 93rd. They were commanded by Sir Colin Campbell, a grit-toothed veteran of the Peninsular campaigns who understood the temperament of his Highlanders better than any man alive. Military convention of the 19th century was rigid on how infantry should receive a cavalry charge. The standard doctrine was to form a square, a tight, hollow box formation presenting a hedge of bayonets in all directions. This made the infantry invulnerable to being flanked or ridden down. But Campbell had a problem. His force was too small, and the ground he needed to cover was too wide. If he formed a square, the Russians would simply sweep around him and sack the supply base. He had to defy the manual. He had to gamble everything on the discipline of his men. Campbell deployed the 93rd not in a square, but in a line, and not even the standard line of 4 ranks deep, but a line only 2 men deep. It was a flimsy, fragile-looking formation, stretched perilously thin across the valley floor. To the watching Russian commanders, it must have looked insane, a suicidal arrogance. Campbell rode down the front of the regiment, his message stark and uncompromising. He told them there was no retreat from that position, and that they must die where they stood. The men of the 93rd, stoic and immovable, reportedly replied that, if needs be, they would do exactly that. As the Russian cavalry crested the ridge and saw the Highlanders, they slowed, suspecting a trap. Surely no commander would expose his infantry in such a way unless there were hidden reserves or artillery waiting in ambush. But there was no trap. There were only 500 Scots in red coats and kilts, standing in absolute silence. As the Russians accelerated into a charge, the ground shaking beneath thousands of hooves, the 93rd did not flinch. They did not fire prematurely. They waited until the enemy was within effective range. At 600 yards, the line erupted. A volley of Minié rifle fire crashed into the Russian ranks, not to kill, but to disrupt. The cavalry kept coming. At 350 yards, a second volley tore through the air. The discipline required to reload a muzzle-loading rifle while a wall of horses gallops toward you is unimaginable. Yet the Highlanders performed the drill with machine-like calm. The Russian charge faltered, swerving away from the sheet of lead and steel. Some of the younger Highlanders, eager for the fight, started to step forward to charge the cavalry with bayonets, but Campbell, ever the professional, growled at them to stay in line. From the heights above, William Howard Russell, the war correspondent for The Times, watched the scene unfold. In his dispatch to London, he described the Highlanders not as a military unit, but as a thin red streak tipped with a line of steel. The public imagination, captivated by the imagery, shortened it to the thin red line. It became the ultimate symbol of British resolve, coolness under fire, the triumph of discipline over brute force. But in celebrating the British victory, the public often overlooked the specific identity of the victors. This was not a generic British line, it was a Highland line, holding the pass when all others had fled, cementing the paradox that the Empire's greatest defenders were the men from its wildest margins. The glory of Balaclava, however, cast a long and seductive shadow. It solidified a concept that had been percolating in the British military establishment for decades. The theory of the martial race. Victorian anthropologists and generals alike convinced themselves that certain peoples within the Empire, the Sikhs, the Gurkhas, and preeminently the Highland Scots, were genetically predisposed to war. They were viewed as possessing a natural, almost feral courage that the more civilized Englishmen had lost. While this might sound like a compliment to the prowess of the Scot, in practice it was a death sentence. To be designated a martial race was to be designated the tip of the spear. It meant that when a general looked at a map and saw a fortress that could not be taken, or a ridge that was swept by artillery, he looked for the tartan. The Scottish regiments became the army's designated shock troops. They were the first in and the last out, consistently assigned the most hazardous duties of any campaign. In the Peninsular War, when the walls of Badajoz had to be stormed, a task known as the Forlorn Hope because survival was statistically unlikely, it was the Scots of the Light Division and the Highland regiments who were thrown into the breach, clambering over their own dead to hack at the French defenders. The statistics of this reliance are sobering. Throughout the Napoleonic Wars and the colonial campaigns of the 19th century, Scottish units suffered casualty rates that were frequently higher than their English or Irish counterparts. This was not because they were less skilled, it was because they were used harder. They were a resource to be spent. The 93rd Highlanders may have survived Balaclava with relatively few losses, but in other engagements, regiments like the 42nd or the 92nd were decimated, effectively wiped out, and rebuilt with fresh recruits from the glens multiple times over. The thin red line was often thin simply because so many men had already fallen. This sacrifice creates a jarring dissonance when placed against the backdrop of events back in Scotland. At the very moment these men were conquering continents for the Crown's economic policies were dismantling their homeland. The 19th century saw the acceleration of the Highland clearances. The same aristocracy that commissioned officers to lead these regiments was systematically evicting the families of the rank and file to make way for Cheviot sheep and deer forests. It was not uncommon for a soldier to return from years of service in India or America, his chest heavy with medals and his body scarred by service to the king, only to find his ancestral home a ruin and his family gone, forced onto emigrant ships bound for the colonies he had helped secure. There is a profound tragedy in this dynamic. The Scottish soldier was fighting for an abstract concept of Britain that offered him little protection as a citizen. Yet the regiments themselves became a surrogate nation. Denied a traditional clan structure at home, the Highlander transferred that fierce, feudal loyalty to the regiment. The colonel became the chief. The colours became the hearth. They fought with such desperation, not because they loved the empire, but because they refused to fail the man standing next to them. The esprit de corps of the Scottish regiments was forged in this crucible of displacement. They were men with nowhere else to go, and so they went into the fire. The cost of the empire was therefore paid twice over by the Scots, once in the blood spilled on foreign fields, and again in the erasure of the communities that had raised them. The government in London was happy to export the martial spirit of the Highlands, while simultaneously extinguishing the culture that produced it. They wanted the fruit, but they were cutting down the tree. The result was a military legacy of unparalleled distinction, built upon a foundation of social tragedy. The British victory was often a Scottish sacrifice, a transaction where the currency was the lives of young men from the glens, who found their only validation in the chaos of battle. While the physical cost was high, the Scottish regiments cultivated a unique asset that went beyond mere bayonet strength: psychological warfare. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the visual and auditory components of an army were designed to intimidate, but few militaries mastered this art quite like the British did with their Highland units. The British Army weaponized the very symbols of Scottish culture, the kilt and the great Highland bagpipe, transforming them from markers of rebellion into tools of imperial terror. To the modern eye, the kilt might seem like ceremonial dress, a quirky relic of a bygone era. But to a French conscript in 1815, or a Russian soldier in 1854, the sight of a regiment in kilts was deeply unsettling. European warfare was dominated by standardized uniforms: breeches, gaiters, shakos. The Highlander broke this visual mold entirely. He looked wild, archaic, and unpredictable. This otherness was actively cultivated. Opposing armies often had nicknames for the Scottish troops that reflected this fear. The French referred to them as les diables en jupons, the devils in skirts. This wasn't mockery. It was an acknowledgement of a ferocity that seemed to defy the civilized rules of engagement. And then there was the sound. The bagpipe is a polarizing instrument, but on the battlefield its effect is primal. It is loud, dissonant, and carries over the roar of musketry and cannon fire like nothing else. For the Scottish soldier, the skirl of the pipes was a rallying cry, a connection to home and history that cut through the panic of combat. For the enemy, it was the soundtrack of their impending doom. There are countless accounts from the Peninsular War and Waterloo of French morale crumbling simply because they heard the pipes starting up in the distance. They knew who was coming. They knew that the men marching to that sound did not fight with the cool detachment of the English line infantry, but with a visceral, aggressive passion. The British High Command understood the value of this brand. They realised that the Scottish regiments projected an image of invincible savagery that could win skirmishes before a shot was fired. This is why, even as the practicalities of war changed, the kilt remained. It was a uniform that told a story. It said to the enemy, "We are different. We are harder. We are the men of the mountains." Even the tall ostrich feather bonnets worn by the regiments were designed to make the men look giant, imposing, and inhumanly tall as they emerged from the smoke of battle. However, this branding had a complex internal effect on the Scots themselves. It created a feedback loop. The more the world feared the wild Highlander, the more the Scottish soldiers felt compelled to live up to that caricature. They cultivated a hyper-masculine, hyper-aggressive identity to fit the role the Empire had cast for them. They became prisoners of their own reputation, obliged to demonstrate reckless bravery to maintain the honour of the regiment. This psychological dimension extended to the very colonisation process. In the outposts of the Empire, in Canada, Australia and New Zealand, the Scottish soldier was often the face of British authority. Interestingly, Indigenous populations often distinguish between the redcoats and the men in skirts, sometimes according the Scots a strange level of respect as fellow tribal warriors. Yet, this shared recognition did not stop the Highlanders from being the ruthless enforcers of colonial rule. They were the Empire's ultimate paradox, a conquered people used to conquer others, wielding their cultural distinctiveness as a weapon for the very power that had once tried to destroy it. The pipes that had once called the clans to fight against the king now signalled the king's dominion over the earth. There is a strange and compelling twist in this saga, one that moves beyond the battlefield and into the soul of the nation itself. While the British Army used the Scots to build an empire, the Scots used the British Army to save themselves from cultural extinction. In the mid-18th century, following the Union and the crushed Jacobite rebellions, there was a concerted political effort in London to erase the concept of Scotland entirely. The preferred nomenclature in Westminster was North Britain. The goal was full assimilation, turning the Northern Kingdom into merely a collection of northern counties, indistinguishable from Yorkshire or Northumberland. But the regiments stood in the way of this erasure. Inside the army, the distinctiveness of the Scot was not only preserved, it was codified. While the politicians were trying to ban the word Scotland, the generals were raising regiments named the Royal Scots, the Scots Greys, and the Highlanders. The military became the one arena where retaining a separate national identity was considered an asset rather than a liability. The regiment became an ark, carrying the symbols, the music, and the pride of a nation through the floodwaters of assimilation. This created a unique form of unionist nationalism. Scots could be fiercely proud of their Scottishness because of their service to the British Empire, not in spite of it. The kilt, once a mark of the savage outlaw, underwent a miraculous rehabilitation. By the mid-19th century, thanks to the exploits of the Black Watch and the Thin Red Line, the tartan had become the ultimate symbol of loyal heroism. It became fashionable. Queen Victoria herself fell in love with this romanticized, martial version of the Highlands, dressing her own family in kilts and spending her summers at Balmoral. The very culture that had been prescribed by law in 1746 was, a century later, the height of royal fashion. However, this victory of identity came with a heavy layer of historical amnesia. To embrace the noble Highlander serving the Queen, the British public had to forget the starving Highlander being cleared from his land. The narrative was sanitized. The rough, complex reality of Gaelic culture was smoothed over into a postcard image of loyal warriors. The British public loved the idea of the Scottish soldier, but they rarely understood the desperate socio-economic pressures that kept the recruiting sergeants busy in Glasgow and Inverness. Furthermore, this military prowess allowed Scotland to punch well above its weight within the imperial hierarchy. It wasn't just the rank and file. The officer class of the British Army was disproportionately Scottish. This military service opened doors to colonial administration. A disproportionate number of governors, viceroys, and merchants who ran the empire were Scots, men who had used the army as a stepping stone to power. If England provided the capital for the empire, Scotland provided the management and the muscle. Yet, in the broad strokes of history taught in schools today, this nuance is often lost. We speak of British victories. We look at maps of the British Empire. This terminology, while politically accurate, serves to dilute the specific contributions of the nations involved. It allows the default assumption that British simply means English with extras. But as we have seen, in the context of the 18th and 19th century military, British was often a synonym for a multinational coalition, where the heavy lifting was done by the Celtic fringe. The legacy of this is visible in the town squares of Scotland today. Walk through any major Scottish town, from the grand avenues of Edinburgh to the industrial heart of Glasgow, and you will find them dominated by statues of field marshals and generals. The war memorials are central to the civic geography. This is a nation that defined its modern self through martial service. But as we look back from the 21st century, we must ask, was this a partnership or was it a purchase? Did the Empire give Scotland a global stage, or did it merely consume Scotland's young men to fuel a machine that ultimately served the interests of London? The answer, like the history of the regiments themselves, is complex, woven from threads of genuine heroism and cynical exploitation. Today, if you walk into the quiet, dusty corners of Scotland's great cathedrals, St Giles in Edinburgh or Glasgow Cathedral, you will see them hanging from the high stone walls, the old regimental colours. They are threadbare now, faded by centuries of sunlight and shadow, often reduced to little more than silk netting held together by the weight of their own history. But look closely. Read the names stitched in gold thread upon them: Quebec, Seringapatam, Waterloo, Sevastopol, Lucknow. These are not just place names, they are the coordinates of a global sacrifice. They are the receipts for the price Scotland paid to sit at the high table of empire. History has a way of smoothing over the rough edges. It prefers simple stories. Britain conquered the world is a simple story. It suggests a unified purpose and a uniform people. But as we have seen, this is an incomplete narrative. To accept the myth of the monolithic British Army is to do a disservice to the men who actually stood in the line. It erases the specific cultural DNA that made those regiments function. It ignores the fact that for a century, the British way of war was fundamentally defined by the Highland Charge and the stubborn, unyielding discipline of the Lowland Square. The legacy of the Scottish soldier is a dual one. It is a source of immense national pride, a testament to a small nation's ability to project power and courage on a scale that defies logic. The thin red line remains a potent symbol of resilience, a reminder that when the odds are impossible, the Scot stands firm. But we must also acknowledge the ghosts that stand behind that line. We must look at the empty glens of the Highlands today, landscapes that are beautiful but hauntingly silent. That silence is a monument too. It is the void left by the thousands of young men who took the king's shilling to escape poverty, marched away to the sound of the pipes, and never returned. The British Empire was built on many things: Royal Navy oak, Manchester cotton, and London gold. But its borders were drawn and defended by Scottish steel. The British Army was never truly a monolith. It was a mosaic, a complex assembly of nations. And the reddest, most vibrant tile in that mosaic was the one forged in the north. So the next time you see a painting of the Redcoats or watch a film about the Napoleonic Wars, look past the uniform, look for the kilt, listen for the pipes, and remember that the story of the British Army is, in its most dramatic and desperate chapters, the story of Scotland. The thin red line was not just a formation on a battlefield, it was the artery through which the lifeblood of a nation flowed, spilling out across the world to colour the map pink, leaving behind a legacy of glory, tragedy, and an enduring, undeniable valour. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden history of the British Army and want to support more documentaries that challenge the mainstream narrative, please make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments, do you view the Scottish regiments as victims of empire or its greatest champions? Until next time.